Well, we're going to go ahead and get the panel started. If you this year, of course, is the 50th anniversary of the lunar landing, but it was earlier the 50th anniversary of a couple of the earlier Apollo missions. Last October was the anniversary of Apollo 7, and of course, May of this year was the 50th anniversary of Apollo 10. But of course, Apollo there was a great program, and it was one that took a lot of effort, and the individuals that are sitting here in front of you today all were participants in the Apollo program and all played a part in it. And they made significant contributions to Apollo. But Apollo got started back in May of 1961 when President Kennedy made the announcement we were going to go to the moon and return astronauts take them to the moon and return them safely to the Earth. And that was really prompted by events earlier than in the month, or a month ahead of that. Because on April 12th of 1961, Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth. And then the next week, there was an abortive invasion in Cuba that embarrassed the Kennedy administration. But Kennedy came in January of 1961 with a lot of expectations that with his new administration, he was going to do great things. So after those two events in April, he asked the vice president who headed up the Space Council, which had been formed, for a recommendation on what could we do in space that would at least give us a 50-50 chance of beating the Soviet Union before they achieved that goal. And on May 5th of 1961, Alan Shepard launched, and it was a suborbital flight. And then 3 weeks after that, after the vice president came back to the president and recommended going to the moon, the president announced on May 25th in a joint session of the Congress that we were going to go to the moon. And it was just a little over 8 years later that we were on the moon. And that's kind of interesting because if you look at that, where we were at that point, we had just flown a suborbital flight of Mercury. John Glenn hadn't orbited the Earth, but the president said we're going to go to the moon, and we were at that point hadn't figured out quite how to do that. But we did that within 8 years. We flew 5 more Mercury flights. We designed and built a Gemini spacecraft and flew 10 Gemini flights. And then we flew 5 Apollo flights, landing on the moon. We did all that in 8 years. And this past July was the 8th anniversary of the end of the shuttle program. And in those 8 years since the shuttle program ended, we've been working very hard on 3 capsules, trying to get American astronauts into orbit. And it's interesting that those 8 years have gone by, and in these 8 years in this decade, we still haven't got an American into orbit in one of those capsules yet. So something's changed over the period of time. In that same 8-year period, we did some remarkable things. And there are probably some younger people here in the audience that maybe weren't around when some of these events occurred. So, Kevin, if you would show that video for a moment.
It was on a clear morning at the Kennedy Space Center's Launch Pad 34 in Florida that we witnessed the beginning of the first manned mission in the United States Apollo program to land astronauts on the moon. The purpose of the flight of Apollo 7 could be stated very simply: prove that the spacecraft command and service modules would function properly in space, long enough to carry men to the moon and back. The astronauts were spacecraft commander Walter Schirra and pilots Don Isley and Walter Cunningham.
Thrust is okay.
This is the launch of Apollo 7.
Very early in the flight, the general pattern of go for Apollo 7 was established in a conversation between the spacecraft and mission control at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, Texas.
Right on the old button. Across the board,
Apollo 7, we have you go for orbit. You're go for orbit.
Next, the spacecraft and S-4B stage were separated. The question now was whether the astronauts could turn their spacecraft around and control it to the degree required for future physical link-ups with equipment in space. For this, too, would have to be done in the lunar flight. And again, the answer was yes. The following day, Apollo 7 burned its spacecraft propulsion system for the first 2 times in the mission and returned to its 4-jawed alligator, which was now angrier than ever. Then, as we were to see in some of the most dramatic film ever returned from space, the crew would settle down to a weightless life in a spacecraft with 4 times more room than Gemini. There would be a host of other tests under a host of other conditions. The equipment and systems required to sustain men's lives, to guide and control and propel the spaceship, to provide electric power, to communicate with those on Earth, would time and again prove their mettle. At approximately 259 hours and 39 minutes after liftoff, the spacecraft propulsion system was burned for the final time, and Apollo 7 headed home to Earth.
The flight director for that mission is in front of you as well.
May 18, 1969. We were almost ready. Man had orbited the moon once. Man had test flown the lunar module, the lunar landing craft, in Earth orbit once. But before we would commit men to a lunar landing, there were still a number of things to be worked out. This was the mission of Apollo 10. In the words of its commander, Tom Stafford, to sort out all the unknowns and pave the way for a lunar landing. Apollo 10 was headed for its initial parking orbit around the Earth.
There's Glenn.
After the checkout in orbit, it was time for TLI, Translunar Injection, the burn of the S-4B engine to send Apollo 10 to the moon. Now, the command and service module separated from the S-4B and turned around to dock with the lunar module. It was time to continually check the trajectory and the spacecraft. The command module, call sign Charlie Brown, the lunar module, Snoopy. It was time for conversation, and it was time for showing the people at home on the Earth what space travel is like. The crew of Apollo 10 was getting ready for lunar orbit. Checklists gone over. Clocks synchronized, computers updated. LOS, loss of signal. The burn to place the spacecraft into lunar orbit would take place behind the moon, out of contact with Earth. Later, a second burn would make the orbit circular, 60 miles above the moon. The flight controllers waited for AOS, acquisition of signal. For the second time, 3 Americans orbited the moon. The electronic senses of MISFIN, the manned spaceflight network, followed their flight, measuring precisely their orbital path, 250,000 miles from Earth, 60 miles above our desolate satellite. Now it was time for lunar module pilot Gene Cernan to crawl into the lunar module called Snoopy to check it out for the next day's descent. The next day, Stafford and Cernan were in the lunar module, John Young in the command module called Charlie Brown. They checked out Snoopy for the last time. The undocking took place behind the moon. When contact was re-established, Snoopy and Charlie Brown were ready for the separation maneuver prior to descent. DOI, descent orbit insertion, would come about 180 degrees from landing site 2, the primary site for Apollo 11. Then, one of the key aspects of the mission. Tom Stafford describes the landing site selected for Apollo 11. Now it was time to begin the rendezvous. On this first low orbit, they would make the initial burn to put Snoopy and Charlie Brown into the proper phase relationship for the coming maneuvers. Now the rendezvous sequence came step by step. But the day was not over yet. They still had to prepare the ascent stage and command module for their final separation. With each revolution, the figures were being pinned down, closer and closer, in preparation for the arrival of Apollo 11. But now it was time to head home to Earth. Trans-Earth Injection. The one burn of the mission that absolutely had to work. The burn that would push Apollo 10 out of its lunar orbit. Down from the moon toward the coast of Earth, Apollo 10 sped on its incandescent path toward its dawn rendezvous at sea.
Those were very significant missions. Apollo 7 was really the first manned Apollo flight, and it was a critical flight because that really set the pace for all the other missions. We had laid out a program for the lunar landing, and we were proceeding on it in the summer of 1968. And George Lowe, who was program manager, had taken a short vacation because he'd been working 7 days a week, almost 24 hours a day since the Apollo fire, trying to get the program on track. And he came back from that vacation and said that he didn't think that we were going to be able to make the landing on the moon by the end of the decade if we stayed on the present plan. And he came back with a proposal that said if Apollo 7 was flown in October, he was going to propose going to the moon on Apollo 8 2 months later. And he was successful in selling that program to the NASA leadership. And they agreed to that if Apollo 7 was going to be a successful flight. And following its flight, there was an agreement, yes, it was completely successful, and we were going to go to the moon, and that was announced in November 1968. We went to the moon 2 months after Apollo 7, and that program was sending just the command and service module to the moon. And taking that step really allowed us to really learn much more about navigation and flying around the moon, and made it easier because we had one spacecraft rather than two. And then we flew Apollo 9 2 months later, after 8, and that was a mission where we proved the lunar module in Earth orbit. And then 2 months later, we were ready to go back to the moon, and Tom Stafford took Apollo 10 back to the moon, and it was a dress rehearsal for the lunar landing that was done 2 months after Tom's flight in May. 2 months later, we did Apollo 11. So those flights were really critical leading up to that event, and these individuals all played a part in all of that. And we have actually Bill Carpentier, who was the Apollo 11 flight crew surgeon. Jay Honeycutt on the end was very much involved as a sim soup, doing the training for all the crews in the control center. And then we had Walt Cunningham, who flew on Apollo 7. And of course, Glenn Lunny, who was a flight director for Apollo 7 and for the subsequent Apollo missions. And of course, Tom Stafford. So we got a great group this morning, and they can answer any question you have on Apollo. So I'll turn it over to Richard.
I promise I won't take more than a couple of minutes because I know we want to get to the panel. But Chuck Berry has always been kind of iffy whether he'd be able to make it or not. It's a day-to-day thing, and apparently he isn't going to. I'll say just a few words that Chuck might have mentioned. Were he here, one of the things he talked about a lot was how the National Academy of Sciences and how some of the outside people were very negative toward human spaceflight and negative toward what they had done in preparations for the flight. George has already gone through John Kennedy and the schedule for that. I think it's amazing that John Kennedy probably needed a PR deal after the Bay of Pigs, but it's amazing that Jerome Wiesner gave him a report in January of 61 that was really negative about Mercury. And they put together in February a special presidential advisory panel and an ad hoc committee of 10, 12 people to review Mercury. And some of the things weren't that bad, but medically they were totally negative. Let me just read you just briefly from that ad hoc report that was filed the day Gagarin flew, April the 12th of 61, just months before he said, let's go to the moon. It is not known whether the astronauts are likely to border on respiratory or circulatory collapse and shock, suffer a loss of consciousness or cerebral seizures, or be disabled from inadequate respiratory or heat control. These uncertainties are awesome. Data from NASA and the DoD aircraft high-altitude balloon flights demonstrate a demanding constellation of stresses yet measurements are not available which would provide assurance of physiological fitness and survivability characteristics of the pilots. Essential observations which could provide the basis for extrapolation have not been made during or after these flights, nor during ground simulation tests. The considered opinion reluctantly arrived at by the panel is that the clinical aspects of the Mercury program have been inadequate. We find that this opinion is also shared by Mercury consultants, by individuals contributing to the simulation training program, and by other qualified observers. So this is 2 weeks, give or take, before Alan Shepard's flight. They say, we recommend a crash effort to obtain additional medical data through centrifuge testing, combining stresses, additional primate flights, which some said they'd wanted up to 50, but that was not in the final report, that compare humans and primate responses before committing an astronaut to Mercury. So that was the report that the president got from his own people, and just a few weeks later, he says, let's go to the moon. It's amazing that he did that. You got to give him credit for that. One other thing I'll mention about the medical stuff, because Bill Carpentier was the crew surgeon, but he doesn't do the stuff in mission control. He gets deployed to landing sites, and this was probably the most boring medical Apollo flight that there ever was. No fiberglass like in Apollo 10, nothing exciting. To give you an example, there were 8 tablets taken that were recorded for Apollo 11. Both crew members took low modal before they got into the LEM. They didn't want to have bowel movements on the surface of the moon, so they took low modal to slow down GI motility. And then all 3 of the crew members took scope decks before they deorbited and once they hit the water, because as Tom knows, the Apollo capsule may be great in space, but it's not much of a boat. And they did take scope decks. And supposedly the lunar module pilot took aspirin before sleep. He liked to use aspirin, but that wasn't recorded in the logs whether they used the aspirin or not. So it was a fairly boring flight. Not a whole lot happened, thank goodness. We have a great panel. I'm going to start with Tom, and Tom's from Oklahoma, and Tom's a hero for all Oklahomans. And it's unfortunate that Alexei Leonov died, but Alexei, based on Tom and our language, and you know how my language is, he's the one that coined the word Oklahomsky for how Tom spoke Russian. And that came from Alexei. Tom we had 2 major generals yesterday. He's a lieutenant general. They have to salute him. He went to the Naval Academy, but then has had a long Air Force career, ending up as Deputy Chief of Staff of the Air Force Research and Development area. He flew on Gemini 6, where they did the very first rendezvous. If you all know the steps leading up to Apollo, that Gemini had to do some things. They had to do rendezvous, they had to do docking, they had to change orbits, of course, and they had to do EVA. And he did 2 of the 2 rendezvous, both on Gemini 6, which was the first, and then on Gemini 9 did rendezvous. And I think he's done more rendezvous in space than anybody. He did 6 different rendezvous during his 4 flights. He also, because Bassett and C were involved in an airplane crash and were fatally injured, he repeated real quick and flew on Gemini 9, where they had, with Gene Cernan, and had a lot of exciting things with regard to their EVA that Tom had to deal with on that flight. And of course he did on Apollo 10, and on Apollo 10 he got down to, I think, 9 miles above the surface. Isn't that right, Tom? 9 miles, it got really close. Of course the lunar module was a little bit heavy for landing, and in fact they did for the medical people, they did a survey of the medicines and things in the LEM, and they looked at how many Band-Aids were in the LEM. And the LEM had 12 Band-Aids, and they said, let's take out half of them. Let's just fly with 6 Band-Aids because that's too heavy. So that's, between his flights and the time they actually landed, they had a real big program to get it lighter. But one of the things you may not realize is that the highest G-forces anyone ever experienced in the space program was Alan Shepard's. But Tom and his crew were the fastest ever to come in. They were at Mach 36. And since his other 2 crew members have died, you're looking at the world's fastest living human, at 36 Gs. he's also, as you know, is Leroy here? Leroy Chow? Anyway, he's still very active. He's wanting to meet Leroy and talk to him about COPVs and the SpaceX booster rockets. He's still involved in safety, looking at things for in the Russians, looking at things in the United States on safety committees. He's never really retired from being involved in the space program and being very active. So a great career, and we're excited to hear you're talking. Glenn Lunny, George introduced everybody a little bit, but Glenn is one of the flight director extraordinaires, and certainly I think you did black team for Apollo 11 and did Ascent, did the Ascent part of it. Of course, Glenn is the one on Apollo 13, which you probably might want to even talk about this, that about an hour after the explosion of on the vehicle, he's the one that came in with his team, and they're the ones that got things stabilized, moved the control and command from the command module up to the lunar module, tried to avoid a critical state that would keep them from being able to get back to Earth, and saved essentially Apollo 13, he and his team. Great, great effort. Bill Carpentier, one of the things that Bill did was, we talked about the 4 Gemini, he did 4 Gemini flights and did 3 Apollo flights, but the first 3 that went to the moon, they had to do the quarantine, where they, do the biological garments, they had the mobile quarantine facility, and then they had to stay in the lunar receiving lab. He did that for both Apollo 11 and Apollo 14. And since they count from the time you leave the Earth, leave the moon and come back, he was in there like in that either the quarantine facility or in the lunar receiving lab for 18 days or so, both of those missions. So we're really interested in hearing about that. Of course, Walt we've met quite a bit, and Walt, remember we talked yesterday about Walt having a heart attack. You remember that? But and then Jay Honeycutt came to NASA in 1966 and started off in the Apollo program and worked in flight operations for a long time. He eventually has transitioned to worked shuttle at JSC at headquarters, and then went down to Florida where he was in charge of the shuttle operations in Florida, and eventually ended up as the center director at the Kennedy Space Center. He's had a great career. So we're going to start with Tom. He's got quite a few things he wants to say, and then hopefully we'll get some questions when everybody's finished.
Thank you, Dr. Jennings. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I think it's wonderful, the International Biomedical Summit that Mr. Abbey has put on here at Rice University at the Baker Institute. And being strictly a hardware guy, I was fascinated by the presentation this morning and also the one last night. I'm on a rather busy schedule. I got in yesterday afternoon late, and I've got an early afternoon flight to Florida, and then I leave early the next afternoon to Russia to participate in the state funeral for my dear friend Alexei Leonov. So I'm kind of hustling around here. But as George had covered earlier, this presentation, I'm also a member of the National Academy of Engineering, and we just had our annual meeting up in Washington, and the theme was 50th anniversary of Apollo, and I had the keynote opening address there, went through how the decisions were made. I think it's one thing we might bring up was in that decision, as George pointed out, Jerome Wiesner and his group are feeding all these negative inputs on Project Mercury. In the meanwhile, April the 12th, Yuri Gagarin did 1 orbit around the Earth, and to great world acclaim. And then 7 days after that, on April the 7th, 5 days after that, on April the 17th, the Cuban exiles, organized under the CIA, invaded at the Bay of Pigs, and that went on for about 3 days. It was kind of a disaster. A lot were killed, were captured, a few got away. So Kennedy's administration really were looking second rate compared to the Soviet Union. So he needed a winner. And then he saw the claim then what Al Shepard did on May the 5th, where Al had 15 minutes of flight. When 115 miles in altitude, he had 0 gravity all of 5 minutes in that thing. So he turned to his vice president and said, Lyndon Johnson said, Mr. Vice President, I want to know in no more than 2 to 3 weeks what we can do in space that will be very significant technically, it'll help us economically, put us ahead of the Soviet Union and show that we are the world's #1 leader. He said, yes, sir, I'll do that. So with that, Vice President Lyndon Johnson got a hold of Administrator Jim Webb. We had Dr. Gilruth from the center, Max Faget, that you all have heard about, who designed the shape of the Mercury, Gemini, Apollos. Von Braun from Huntsville and one of his assistants, Abe Silverstein from Lewis. And so, also he asked Mr. Webb, says, how much will it cost? And they all got together. And they came up with this, number one, and this is what Lyndon Johnson relayed back to President Kennedy. Number one, there is no way that we can beat the Soviets in a free return trajectory around the moon. And our first missions we flew were free return. And that's exactly what the Soviets did. They went with a stripped down Soyuz that didn't have the orbital ball in the front of it, weighed about 11,000 pounds, be on top of a proton booster, a 6-engine first stage, then an upper stage. It's about equal to our Delta Heavy or the Titan IV, if you remember that, about 50 to 55,000 pounds due east. But that booster with they call it the Zond, Z-O-N-D, which means kind of a probe in Russian. And that would take them into a 105 by about 280,000 mile orbit. You plan it right, get swung around the moon and right back to the Earth, called free return trajectory. Said we can't beat them, they'll beat us. He was absolutely right, and that's what the Soviets went full blower for. Number two, there's only a 50-50 chance that we can beat the Soviets in orbiting the moon. And I think he was close on that. He said, however, number three, we are certain that if we go and land on the moon and safely return, the Soviets, they can't beat us. They'll put us way ahead of them. They'll give us the most benefit from that. And number three, and the fourth, how much will it cost? Well, Gilruth, Von Braun, all of them said, well, a Titan can put so much up, it costs so much. They came up with a number of $10 billion. And Mr. Webb was a very wise man. He had been director of OMB. It was really called the Bureau of Budget under Truman. And he ran Senator Bob Kerr's, a lot of his conglomerate. He knew about cost growth. He said, no, it'll cost $20 billion. And so that's what Lyndon Johnson told the president, it'll cost $20 billion. And right there, Kennedy said, all right, we'll go to the moon. That's how fast the decision was made. Then he went in front of the Congress on the 25th of May and said, here's what we're going to do, just like that. So that was how it was all done. Now, I'm strictly a hardware type person. You know, aircraft, spacecraft, air-to-air missiles, air-to-ground missiles, ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons, conventional weapons, but I'm fascinated by all this biomedical part. It's really super what we've heard. But there were three technologies that we had. Two of them was done before Kennedy made the announcement. He didn't have any feel for it. But if we hadn't had those three technologies, we would have fallen flat on our back on going and landing on the moon. The first started in 1955. That was done by General Benny Schriever, the father of the Air Force ballistic missile and space program. And the only thermonuclear weapons we had then were wet thermonuclear weapons. They were big, heavy things. He had faith we were going to go to a dry one, but he said we need a 1.5 million pound thrust engine, single chamber burning, kerosene and LOX. So that is how the F-1 started. So the Air Force went full blower with money and technology there in 1955, 56, and 57. In 1956, we exploded over the Pacific, late 56, our first dry thermonuclear weapon. And then thermonuclear technology took off like that. And at the end of 57, they decided they didn't need this 1.5 million pound thrust engine, so development stopped. But everything was there, the thrust chamber, injector head, turbo pumps, nozzles. And then after the NAC, it became NASA. There in 58, they started putting a little money into it more and more. And then after the decision to go to the moon, they really pumped money into it, the von Braun and his group. The bigger the thrust chamber, the more susceptible you are to combustion, instability, and explosion. And I remember when I was flying Gemini that occasionally there'd still be an explosion of an F1 engine. And I think Rocketdyne was a contractor, but between Marshall and Rocketdyne, they developed over 100 different types of injector of configurations, and they finally got it right. And every F1 that flew did perfectly. So that was number one. Number two, in 1959, the group got together under Dr. Silverstein of Lewis Lab at Cleveland. Again, von Braun, Dr. Gilruth, Max Fouget. The question was, what fuel should we use to go explore beyond low Earth orbit? And after the debate and discussions, decided that hydrogen was the only real feasible one. Then they had to decide, well, how do you produce it in large quantities? How do you store it, transport it, store it again, use it in an engine? And hydrogen is minus 423 degrees Fahrenheit. So that was the second one. And so this was there in being in work, but when Kennedy made the decision. The final thing, he said, we're going to go to the moon. We had to go, but then the question was, how do we go to the moon? Well, there were several different thoughts. Dr. Gilruth here wanted a giant booster, weighed about 14 million pounds. I think it would have about 10 or 12 F1 engines on it. And it would drop off stages all the way, land direct, come back direct. I don't know how. You'd probably have to have a rappel rope to get out to the lunar surface. The thing would be so big. Anyway, there's no place to build it, so that went by the wayside fairly fast. The second theory, really pushed by von Braun, was a Earth orbit rendezvous using two vehicles about the Saturn V class joined together, and then from there take off and go with a direct landing, dropping off stages, coming back. Well, a chief engineer from Langley, Dr. John Hubel, and his team came up and said, the way to go to the moon, the best way, and he had it all worked out mathematically, is a lunar orbit rendezvous. He kept writing letters. He finally insisted he go see the deputy administrator, Dr. Siemens. Fortunately, Siemens had a good technical background, former dean of aero and astro at MIT. He went up there and practically pounded on his desk and said, we've got to go this way. He convinced Siemens. The hard one to convince was Dr. von Braun. He finally came around. And the Come to Jesus meeting occurred down at Huntsville in July '62, 14 months after Kennedy said we'd go to the moon. We didn't know how. And so Jerome Wiesner was there, the one that was so negative on Mercury and manned spaceflight, with the president. And so they presented this lunar orbit rendezvous. Wiesner was real negative. He said, it won't work. We've never done a rendezvous. You're going to kill astronauts. It's going to be a blemish on your record, Mr. President. We just can't do it. And finally, Webb was there too. He hadn't said anything. He finally got into it. And so I guess it was a face-to-face shouting contest. And finally, Wiesner turned to the president and said, well, Mr. President, what are you going to do? He thought for a minute and he says, well, Webb has all the money. And that was it. We went lunar orbit rendezvous. So without those three things, it had been very difficult to go land on the moon and safely return. We might have had one expedition. I don't know how successful it would be. But then we had a series of things, as you saw. So we took off, and the Soviets, they didn't have a big engine. They ended up with a configuration of 30 engines on their giant N1 booster. But the systems engineering and integration that was developed was tremendous that we had. The Soviets didn't have that. It was kind of stovepiped, all their management thing. And it was interesting. Their N1 booster weighed, it had 10,100,000 pounds, 200,000 pounds of thrust. We had 7,500,000 pounds. But we had hydrogen in the upper stages. They had kerosene. They had a 5-stage booster. It took 3 stages to get in orbit. They could put only 210,000 pounds to low Earth orbit. Because of hydrogen, we could put 300,000 pounds, and later on a little bit more than that. And then Translunar Injection, the Soviets had a separate stage for that. That was the fourth stage. We used about 80% of the fuel that was in that third stage left, I forget the name of it, and that's what gave us the 11,000 feet per second for Translunar Injection. And then the Soviets had a stage for lunar orbit insertion, where we used most of the fuel out of the service module in Apollo to break the service module and the lunar module into orbit, and then the last to kick out. So it was a whole different thing. And what was interesting, well, I felt sorry for the Soviets. They had 4 failures. First one there was in January of '69. And remember, with 30 engines, you had 60 pipes coming down to those engines. 30 fuel, 30 oxidizer. So it was a plumbing nightmare. And the first one got up around 40,000 feet, and a fire broke out. Thing exploded, and they did have a good, I had a Soyuz on top while I was on, and the launch escape system worked well. The second one was very unique. It got up about 300 to 500 feet, and one of the oxidizer pumps ingested a bolt. It exploded the other ones, and it fell back into the flame pit and exploded. And you see estimates on the internet between 2.5 and 4 kilotons. Now, when you think of kilotons, you think always of Hiroshima. Hiroshima was estimated 15 kilotons. So that explosion the Soviets had there in July was about probably 1/6 to 1/7 of what happened in Hiroshima. And of course, we didn't know anything about that as far as being astronauts. We were just dumb astronauts, Walt. We had a secret clearance, but the only ones that knew about it was George Low and General Sam Phillips, the program director.
Quit bragging.
Yeah. I finally saw the pictures when I was Deputy Chief of Staff of the Air Force for Research and Development. I had the clearances, and they showed me courtesy. Here you see this giant booster with the umbilical tower and the lightning towers, and then come over about 4 or 5 days later. Well, there's no umbilical tower, just big black areas, and the lightning towers are all twisted around, and the flame trench is nearly blowing out. It was a real boomer. My good friend Alexei Leonov told me he was in a bunker about 3.5 kilometers away, and it really shook the whole bunker and everything. And it's interesting with all that, the 4th and 5th stages. They said it rained down little droplets of kerosene for about 20 minutes. So then they had 2 other failures. So after the 4th failure, they called it quits. So that was it. And we brought back 842 pounds of material and rocks from the lunar surface in those 6 landings we had. It was a super success.
Thank you, Tom. One thing I forgot to mention about Tom is he's flown 126 different aircraft. So if you've got one, he'd like to borrow it. He's already had experience. Glenn.
Well, I'll talk about partially some of the stuff that Tom talked about, and talk about how it matched. Can you hear me? Okay. I was a young fellow when I got out of college, and I went to I had worked as a co-op student before that, and I went to Cleveland Lab. It was called Lewis at the time, and it was high-speed testing, analytical work on how to re-enter safely. And I arrived there when I got back from my college work, and it was over. Thank God, I was happy about that. But it was an amazing time for me. And what was amazing for me is, and I must admit that it kind of didn't dawn on me at the time, but it dawned on me later. The country, in the person of a lot of the men that you've heard talked about here, and others, the country was rolling. I mean, it was really rolling when we got started on the real astronaut flights. It took a tremendous amount of work to just think through and how to do. We talked about Rendezvous, but the getting to a point where we were comfortable with Rendezvous took a long time. And when they decided to do it, they were betting the farm because it was the smallest solution for going to the moon. Therefore, it's hard to say I got the wrong thing, I'm going to build up. We were working on the thing that was the best and the smallest solution for the program, and it kept us very busy. Tom flew a couple of the early rendezvous, and I was in the control center when those occurred, and they proved out what we were doing. The country, we had committed to making the rendezvous work because the way we could get to the moon was to use what was the smallest package of a launch vehicle that would allow us to do the beginnings of the lunar orbit rendezvous. It was a kind of an exciting time because we had a number of people, young guys, out of college. I was not very long out of college, but when we started in about 1964 to build a team and think through all these things that we had to do, it was a formidable challenge for us. So we got started building all the methods that we were going to use in the control center to plan and execute the rendezvous mission. As a matter of fact, the whole program was dependent on us figuring out how to do rendezvous and how to get it done right. We had walked away from all the much bigger rockets, which probably would have been very difficult to manage and get built. But nevertheless, we went with a smaller version called Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, and took a lot of study, it took a lot of work. But Tom participated in the first couple of rendezvous, the first on Gemini 6 and then on Gemini 9. Tom worked on both of those flights, and he was the ace on board to get the computer program and the mission maneuvers that we had to perform. So Tom was the guy that helped through that, and it was quite a time. And then after that, we had Flight 10, which Tom also participated in Gemini, and we had a Gemini 11, which was a high altitude flight, sending the spacecraft way up. And then we did Apollo 12, and we did the rendezvous just fine, but we had along the way stumbled on really figuring out how to do the EVAs. We I think missed it in the sense of we did it and assumed kind of that, well, everything's going to work fine. And we sort of didn't pay attention to what it would take to keep people in one place. That is where we wanted them to be in the spacecraft, and where they would be able to do maneuvers, where they would able to do the committing of the vehicle to the mission that we had. It took a lot of practice and it took a lot of time, but it went fast. When Tom flew, we had people in the control center who were probably about 21, 22, or whatever, about that area. And we'd just gotten out of college, and I'd just gotten out of college not too long before that. And I did a lot of things, and they put me into the control center to help with the rendezvous and protect the schedule that we would have and the likelihood that we would be able to get to the moon with the lunar orbit rendezvous technique. So we tackled that job, and we created a bunch of people, young men, who did that job, and they did it very, very well. I tell people who come to the center to ask us how we did it so fast and how we did it so well. And in telling that story to them, I told them about how young the people were. We started to hire guys in 1964. We had a handful, 4 or 5 of us, that could do the work. And then as we went through Gemini, we built that up to maybe a dozen or more. But when we landed on the moon, the average age of the people in the control center who were the operators, not counting, the doctors, not counting the not counting the PAO.
We understand.
Yeah, took longer to train them. So we ended up with a team of people. The average age was 27 when we landed on the moon. And the operators in that room are the people that I was talking about. And it was a satisfying thing for us because we were optimistic. We talked about all these things that people were creating scenarios in which it would be very difficult for the astronauts to succeed, but we just kind of meddled away on what we had to do and figured out how to put it in place. And the rendezvous was well in place by the time we finished the Gemini mission. We did some more rendezvous in practice in orbit before we went to the moon, but we knew that we could do it when we got done with Gemini. So the other thing I would like to mention, and it's hard to describe to people in this thing that was going on. I mean, we started with the Mercury flight. We had 4 manned flights. Then we had Gemini, and we had 10 manned flights with rendezvous in all of them almost. And then we had 5 flights on the way to landing on the moon. So it was a fairly compressed schedule, and we had to do everything that we could to be sure that every mission counted, and we wanted to be sure that we didn't waste any time. You mentioned, Tom, somebody mentioned Gemini, or Apollo 8. Apollo 8 was a remarkable decision. I mean, we were taking this big Saturn V, and the last time we flew it, it didn't work very well. We had a failure in every stage, up to including the engine didn't light, things like that. It was a series of problems that had to be faced, and so people got started on it, and I was participating in the planning and the execution of the missions, but by this time I was old enough or experienced enough to realize just how powerful the team that we were putting in the spacecraft and in the control center. The team was good. They could do that. They were absolutely assured in their own minds that we could do whatever it is we had to do. I think that was true of all the crew members that flew, and it was true of the young people that we had in the control center. They did a marvelous job. And they didn't get there all by themselves. We had Dr. Guruth running the center, but we had his ace lieutenant was Chris Kraft, who, by the way, just passed away in January, a couple days after we had simulated, after we had practiced what would be done on the lunar module. So it was an exciting time for us, and it was quite a time for us to then participate in the 5th anniversary of it. It was a wonderful experience. But it has, we are at the point where we lost Chris Kraft 2 days after the landing on the moon, and he passed while we were returning the spacecraft, at least the simulated spacecraft that we had planned to fly, not fly, but deploy for people in as best that they could. So the thing that impressed me was we got these young folks in there. They carried the load. You will hear about on the Apollo 11 landing, we were plagued by some alarms from the command from the computer, and the alarms were telling us that you're asking me to do too much. I can't handle it all. So the computer found as a way of ducking that and powering it down a little bit in terms of what they're trying to do. But it was a response to a situation on board the spacecraft which could have led to an abort. And that's what we were concerned about. But we found that if we behaved in a certain way, didn't overstress the computer, and didn't panic when it had a few alarms, that it would be okay, and we could land on the moon successfully. And after it was over, we sent one of our young men up to be the representative of the team, the control center team, and Steve Bale went up to be at a major ceremony up in Washington, D.C., and Steve was a terribly old 26-year-old kid, and he was the one that called it. He had plenty of help, but he was the one that had to call it. So I must say that I was really pleased with those people. The people in the control center were, what would you say, Tom, trained and bred by Dr. Chris Kraft, whom we now have lost. And it was a wonderful thing to see how well people performed. And you can ask 27-year-old people to do a difficult, if not impossible job, and they can do it. I guess I could go on with that, but I wanted to take note of how well we were managed. And I don't think managed is the right word, because it implies meddling a little bit. But Chris Kraft got the team ready, and his job in the control center when we were flying was he just wanted to assure us that we had his back, or he had our back, and he was going to back the team. So the people in the control center and the people across this whole team knew their jobs. They did them very well, and they were very, very well trained and very confident that they knew how to do what had to be done. And I think Chris Kraft probably had as much to do about that as any dozen more people that I could name. And we all will miss his hand in the control center, and we'll miss his hand in terms of problems that have to be worked. But with that, we're moving on to a new generations, and everything that we learned and were able to pass down in the way of procedures and in handbooks and so on, all that stuff's embedded in the people in the control center today. They operated just as well as we ever did back in the old days, and God bless them. I think they can handle any kind of a mission that wants to be had by the Houston Houston requirements, I should say, for flying the next missions and flying them safely. So we're looking forward to that, and I know that the people in the control center can carry out their part of the mission, and they're all just as good as the people were when we went to Apollo. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Just a second. But I don't know how old Garmin was in the back room for Steve Bales, but when he was making those 1201 and 1202 calls, he's 26 years old, and the entire team, you said, it's 27. How old were you?
I was old.
Yeah.
I was about 32,
Yeah.
31.
I always think of Darrell Roll's quote about young football players, that if a dog's going to bite, he'll do it when he's a pup. That young people, if they're good, are good. And you don't have to be old like me to, young people can do great. Another question, though, is you were in charge of Ascent with the black team on Ascent from the Moon, first time, never been done before. Tell me if the entire configuration, the engine, the guidance, how was there ever any all the way through testing, or was that the first time it was all integrated and fired?
We fired all of it along the way. The mission was ahead of that, and Tom flew Apollo 10, which was, it performed exactly all the maneuvers that we would have to perform with the propulsion systems. We just didn't do the final set of sequences that would have allowed us to land on the moon. Probably didn't have enough fuel anyway, Tom, right? Mm-hmm. But we were comfortable with what we had to do, and today I feel like the people in the control center and the people who are planning these missions and the astronaut corps that we got a great team still ready to do whatever the country asks of them.
Thank you very much. Bill?
And one comment about the Ascent Engine. That Ascent Engine was built by Rocketdyne, and 9 months before the landing, we had a Bell engine. We canceled the Bell engine and switched to the Rocketdyne engine, and 9 months later it did the launch.
Wow. That was typical of Apollo, where you had parallel tracks going sometimes, right?
Well, no, it wasn't parallel, it just happened to happen.
Okay. Thanks. Bill?
Okay. I did my residency in aviation aerospace medicine at Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. And I was lucky that part of the training, I did 6 months of the last year of my training residency at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. And then I got hired on as a operational flight surgeon after that. I arrived in Houston in January of 1965, and it was 2 months before the first Gemini flight. Now, the last two Mercury flights, as you may remember, MA8 and MA9, were 9 hours and 34 hours in space. And both of the pilots from these two flights had symptoms of orthostatic hypotension post-flight. And in Gordon Cooper's flight, which was 34 hours, when he was taken out of the spacecraft after it was hoisted on the carrier deck, he got dizzy and he thought he was going to faint and he had to be supported. But after he started moving and took a few steps, he was able to walk. But in the Gemini program that was coming up, the flights were going to be much longer than 34 hours. There was going to be a flight of 4 days, then 8 days, then 14 days. And so it had been decided that there was going to need to be a flight surgeon in the recovery helicopter should medical attention be required by any of the crew. And the flight surgeon that was assigned to the 4-day flight of Gemini 4 was an Air Force flight surgeon, and he was told that he needed to get prepared in case he needed to jump into the water with the underwater demolition team swimmers or the Navy frogmen, should that be required. And he said, I can't do that. I am not a good swimmer. I don't want to end up somewhere in the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, never to be heard from again. So now, I just, at that time, was assigned to the Medical Operations Directorate, and my boss had somehow found out that I was a competitive swimmer. I had scuba diving lessons. So he called me into his office and said, would you do that job? Now, I felt that I could hold my own in the water with anybody, and it took me, 12 milliseconds to say, yes, I want that job. So that's what that became my job for the Gemini program. So that I was able to go out with the recovery team for the 8-day flight of Gemini 5. And as you maybe remember, the Gemini spacecraft landed in the water with the crew sitting upright, not like in Mercury and Apollo where the crew was on their back with their feet up. So it was a concern. So I got to work with the underwater demolition team swimmers, and we worked how we were going to get the crewman out of the spacecraft the fastest way, the best way, get him horizontal onto the life raft, and then how we were going to do CPR on a pliable life raft in 6-foot seas. But we figured it out. Now, I was also trained to do the pre-flight and post-flight medical evaluations during the Gemini program. And so I got a lot of experience doing those things, and I was involved in, as Richard said, 4 of the Gemini flights, and I was involved pre-flight with a couple of others. So that by the end of the Gemini program, I had the most experience doing pre-flight and post-flight medical examinations. And then I was given the job of trying to develop a plan for operational medical evaluations for the Apollo program. Now, there was some hesitancy expressed around the center about how much time we could expect from the crew to perform all these medical exams, and there were some opinions expressed that, look, we've shown that 2 crewmen can tolerate 14 days in space. That's longer than it's planned for a lunar mission. You don't need to do any more medical examinations. So, there were many of us felt that there were still many, many gaps in our knowledge, and that we really needed to do comprehensive medical examinations. Now, there was 2 accepted medical objectives for the Apollo program at that time, and one was to ensure crew health and safety from a medical standpoint, and 2, prevent back contamination from the lunar surface. But after much talking and cajoling, we were able to get a 3rd objective approved, and that was to continue the understanding of the biomedical changes that were shown to be incident to spaceflight. Now, I was the flight surgeon that was assigned to the first Apollo mission, Walt's flight. And so I worked closely with the flight surgeons in the operational division and with the investigators in the research division that we could come up with a program that would help solve problems and help extend our knowledge that would still be accepted by the Apollo crew members. So besides standard clinical evaluations and standard blood chemistry and hematology and the extensive microbiological evaluations that had been proposed, we also wanted to add red cell mass and plasma volume measurements, bone mineral measurements, and cardiovascular measurements that included orthostatic tolerance using lower body negative pressure and exercise response using a bicycle ergometer. Now, because of my working with the underwater demolition team for recovering astronauts, I was assigned to be the crew flight surgeon for the first lunar landing mission. And being able to swim and to work with the underwater demolition team, I got the privilege of being involved in what has been referred to as the greatest adventure and the greatest technological achievement of the 20th century. Now, because of the quarantine requirements, I was would be in the mobile quarantine facility, and I had to work out a program that I could do by myself on the inside with some research investigators on the outside to record the information. Now, the first task that I had to do following recovery and entry into the MQF was to get the microbiology samples. And I had to get swab samples on each crew member from his head to his toes, get urine samples and get fecal samples, and then get into the spacecraft and get samples from the EVA suits and get all around the spacecraft, because we had to be able to show that anything that we grew from the crew or the spacecraft was there before they left. That there wasn't anything that was new. Then my job was to get all of the blood samples that were required for all of the blood testing that needed to be done on each crew member, and get all the pre-processing done so that it could be packaged and locked out and sent back to the Lunar Receiving Laboratory for further analysis. But then we could start on the cardiovascular evaluations. Now, there was not enough room in the MQF to put in an LVNP box, and so I had to come up with something easier, and so I just said, I'd do a passive stand test. Lie him on the dining room table for 5 minutes, get his blood pressure and his heart rate, stand him up for 5 minutes against the wall, and we'd at least get some idea of the changes in orthostatic tolerance. And I was able to move one of the seats in the MQF out and mount a bicycle ergometer so I could get a basic exercise tolerance test done also. So that we were in the MQF for about 3 days until we were transported on the ship to Honolulu. We were offloaded and then loaded onto a C-141, flown back to Houston, put on a truck, and taken to the Lunar Receiving Laboratory, where we got out and we had much more spacious accommodations for the rest of the 21-day quarantine period. Now, during that quarantine day period in the Lunar Receiving Laboratory, I had to do comprehensive examinations every single day and make reports to the outside monitors to make sure they could be satisfied there were no symptoms and no signs of any possible contamination brought back from the moon. So we were able to collect a very good data from the entire Apollo program. And I think we obtained significant new information on the physiological changes that were shown to occur, the possible causes, and what might be done to treat or prevent any adverse findings. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. It's interesting that you were a champion swimmer. I did my water survival with the Navy, and they said I was a natural floater. I don't think that was a compliment. We've kidded quite a bit about Walt's book, but for those of you who aren't familiar with it, Walt wrote a book called The All-American Boys, I believe is the name of it. I think it's still available. It's one of the most honest books I think you'll ever read about the people and the programs involved with the space program. I would encourage you, if you don't have it, to get it. Go ahead, Walt.
Well, sometimes being honest can get you in trouble. But I was thinking about when I was doing that, my whole life I've had this drive to almost be honest. I don't think about it, but if I'd have been smart enough then, I'd have figured out there might have been some things I shouldn't have said in the book. And I'm been listening to some interesting stuff about the spacecraft and the missions and what have you. I think I'll just try to add a thought here or there onto some of those things, and any questions you want to ask me later, I'll be as honest as I can. But actually, Tom Stafford and we worked together for years. And even today, most people don't realize that it wasn't just straightforward and simple to get airborne on Apollo. The Wally Schirra, Don Isley, and I, we were the prime crew for the second Apollo mission, and in that particular role there, as a matter of fact, I think maybe when we started off, you head down, Tom? I'll see you. Be good. Yeah. His crew, and I'm not even sure if it was complete with all three people yet, but they were our backup crew, and we went on for, I think it was about 8 months on that, working with the contractors. As we were doing that, we were making some improvements and some operational changes in that. After about 7 or 8 months, they ended up having to cancel that. So when they canceled that, we ended up being the backup crew for the first Apollo mission, which was Gus Grissom and White and Roger Chaffee. And that was, it was like September or October, and they were going to fly the first mission, and we then hoped to inherit our turn down there. And after about 4 months, towards the end of January there, in that year that was coming up, that crew died in a fire on the pad. Very unusual, but it's to me, as I look back at it now historically, even the operations folks, as time goes by, learn some things that affect what they want to do, and in fact do some of those things different. So in those days, we were all learning how to get to what we wanted to do. We were all relatively young, and we were all committed to doing whatever was necessary to get the job done. I think those kind of objectives, they're changing a bit today. Our society has changed a lot, in my opinion. And so we adjust to some of those things. But here we were, the backup crew for what was in Apollo. Well, it wasn't really officially called Apollo 1, but when they died in the fire, it got kind of referred to as that. But we were the backup crew when Gus, Ed, and Roger died. I guess about 2 weeks later, something like that, we then inherited that flight. So now we were on. It was our third crew assignment, and we were the prime crew again on that particular mission. And all of us were well aware that there were some deficiencies in that spacecraft that we had adjusted to. In those days, which also is a kind of a changed attitude today, if we were aware of what was deficient in a system, almost all of us adjusted to it. We were going to survive it and handle it and do what we were supposed to instead. Occasionally there was a fight that went on kind of operationally, and they would go test something. But it took 21 months after that fire on the pad, and 21 months later to do all the fixing that we had, because while they were fixing a couple of things that were essential, it also gave us time to do some changes that were just highly desirable. Also, what I read today, if I read about it or hear about it or people talk about it, they think that we started over and reinvented some things, I think, for that. I think it was all just a solid improvement. Everybody was working together. With Glenn and the operations, they were doing all that well. Today, when I read some of the discussions of it back then, in the last 10 years, they've created more and more of an attitude, I think, Glenn, that really you guys were doing all the missions, and we were just there to follow directions when you gave it to us. And there were times when we did that. We also, though, were motivated and driven by doing whatever was necessary to get the job done. I've never in my life been related to a situation where so many of the people were willing to do whatever is necessary to get the job done. In the decades since that time, our society has loosened up. Well, I don't think they think of it as that way, but they've gotten to the point where it all has to be pretty much perfect or they're not going to go stick their necks out. I think that's a big loss, in my opinion. During that time, I think we learned a lot from the failures, the errors that we had. After on that particular mission, after it was 21 months, and finally we got to fly. We also had to go through the reorganization of the schedule, which they set up. It got very organized. Right, I think probably it was right about the time of that fire that we had, and they ended up with the missions. It was the thing that was added was, of course, was the Apollo 8 mission. There was kind of a fight going on operationally inside of the organization to get it to come on, because they had been training for that mission, which was out around the moon. Actually started maybe a month or so before our flight, but it was very difficult to get approval on it, and finally they approved it, subject to how things were turning out, and it got assigned 3 or 4 weeks after we got back. But the crew, I thought, was well prepared to do that and go out and around the moon. I really feel bad that we didn't get to go do that, to go out around the moon. But they were being sensible in how they were planning things and sticking their necks out. Also, I don't think they expected in advance, I don't think they expected Apollo 7 to be as successful as it was, because of the problems that we had coming up to that. And now also when I hear somebody talking just recently, they talk about all the work we had in the simulators, and I think they gave me 300 hours of simulator time. Well, they couldn't count too well because we worked our tail off. I got to like 75 hours, which was good and useful, but it grew and with the programs, and we were able to get to the point where you could do all those things that you really needed. Personally, I feel very pleased and very satisfied that I got to take part when I did, when we were still figuring out how to accomplish the things that needed to be done. I probably would not be that successful today, and now we're starting off. Crew selection today is vastly different. Back in those days, every single one of us there at that time were military fighter pilots. All but about 5 or 6 of us were test pilots. We all felt, I'm talking about our crew people, we all felt good about that. And some of the guys, incidentally, I won't mention who, but 3 or 4 of them weren't all that great, as great as me. But in those days, you didn't go around and personalize that much. But then we had like the first 3 crew selections. We ended up with 30 astronauts and pilots in those days. By the time we got to fly that first manned Apollo mission, we were down to 25 of us still alive. There'd been a couple of other selections getting started, including scientist astronauts for the first time, and then another group of pilots. So I think we ended up with at least 3 or 4 people from the next group of pilots that were in there to do that. But the focus was a good one because everybody was motivated. I look back now, and there's probably a couple of the pilots in there. I'm not going to mention the names that I'm glad I didn't fly with, I wouldn't fly with, and things like that. But other people probably felt different about those particular folks. So we had everybody in those days. I think you could count on. Many of us enjoyed working with the operations people in mission control. And I was always impressed as hell that so many of you are so much younger than us. Even you. They were young, and they were driven, and the right attitude was there. Even those places are older today. So I think I'll probably just stop at that. But if you have any questions to ask, feel free. I don't mind answering questions on any particular thing. But I feel vastly pleased and satisfied that I lived at that particular time in getting ready to land a man on the moon. Thank you.
Thank you, Walt. We'll get to Jay in just a second. One of the things I wanted to mention was that I kind of denigrated this report that was filed from Donald Hornig's Special Presidential Advisory Commission. But one of the things they said in there, they pointed out how it was a very big fire hazard to have a capsule at 100% oxygen at 14.7 psi. It's in the report. It says that was a big concern that they had.
Well, but you see, the only time we were at 14.7 psi was before when you closed the hatch and what have you, and of course that changed. I'm going to say something about that in a second.
Let's go ahead and go to Jay so we can get some time in.
Well, let me mention this a little bit, because it was a shock to us when we had that the fire on the pad and the crew got killed in just 10 seconds, something like that. But they had been in there trying to do that test for a long time, hours that afternoon, and they're operating at not 14.7. I think it was over 15 psi at the time, saturated with all of that. Even today, there are places where they do that, unfortunately. But as soon as you could get airborne in those days, everything went down. You'd be operating at 5 psi, which turns out to be pretty practical. But there's limitations even at 5 psi. What's his name? Our Russian friend that just died yesterday?
Valery Polyakov. No, excuse me. Alexei Leonov.
Alexei Leonov. Alexei was operating. He was the first EVA. And he's out there, and I think they were operating at about 5 psi, or I don't remember exactly what it was. He couldn't even get his suit collapsed enough to get in, so they ended up bleeding it all the way down. I think it was less than 3.5 psi. He finally got to where they could squeeze and get him in. The situation with hardware and things like that has evolved. Most of it's an improvement. Some of the only part that I see that I would worry myself about is the attitude that people have about sticking their neck out to do it. Apollo 7, for example, that was the first manned Apollo mission. And they were concerned enough about it because it had problems before on spacecraft. But it was going well enough. We had some personal problems inside the spacecraft. They started adding a few objectives. In fact, I think we had 4 objectives added to that mission after we were airborne. And when we got back, all but 3 of the overall missions had been done, and that spacecraft was judged 101% successful. And to this day, 50 years later, actually 51 years later, that was still the longest, the most ambitious, most successful first test flight of any new flying machine, anywhere, in the world. And we couldn't have done that without the flight operations that we had going on in those days.
Thanks, Paul. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Training is what I was involved in, and that fell really in three areas. There was crew training, which was done by the people over in flight crew ops, where the crews would get exposed to the mission with the simulators that they had over there, and some part task trainers that would do rendezvous and docking, and some EVA training and lunar landing test vehicle. All those things were done by the people in flight crew ops. And in flight operations, which I was a part of, we had the responsibility to train the flight control teams that Glenn talked about, and also to plan and conduct the integrated simulations that the flight control team would run with the flight crew in their simulators. And by an integrated sim, think mini mission or mission phase. The crews were simulators. There were two sets. One set here in Houston of Command Module Simulator, Lunar Module Simulator. That was used primarily for development work and for the initial training of crews as they came on board. There was an equal set down in Florida at the Kennedy Space Center that had a command module, lunar module, and where the crew would go for the final aspects of their training. They'd go down somewhere in a launch minus 3 or 4 month time frame, and then they would run integrated simulations with the flight control team in Houston. In the meantime, we had been training the flight control team through the classic categories, classrooms, and then we built internal crew modules with only switches and no wires behind them to familiarize the flight controller with switch locations, gauge locations, the contents of what the crew was looking at. So when they had an opportunity to request the crew to reach and throw such and such a switch or look for such and such a dial, they had at least a sense of where that equipment was. We conducted classroom trainings for them, and then we built basically an in-house simulator that provided the ephemeris for all the simulations that we ran. It would provide a simulation of all the ground stations, when there would be acquisition, loss of signal, when it would pump in the telemetry streams and the tracking data streams into the control center for their use, and we manned those simulated ground stations with our team. So one of our guys would respond when somebody from the flight team would call asking some question, or they would report in acquisition of signal, loss of signal, that sort of stuff. We also built an internal model of the command module and the lunar module, which we used to initially train the flight control team on what it was like to interface with the vehicle. We again had our guys called Astro Sims who would play astronaut and respond to all the commands, and then we'd type in on our little machine the response to the switch they wanted thrown, or whatever. We also in that big computer. These are IBM 360s, so they're great big things that are this big. And we had a model of the Saturn 1B and the Saturn 5, which again we used to drive the simulators either in Florida or at Houston when the crew was in the vehicle and we were doing launch abort simulations. We practiced all the major mission phases, launches, primarily launch aborts, low Earth orbit stuff, translunar injection, translunar coast, lunar orbit injection, landing, a little bit of lunar ops. Our system didn't accommodate lunar ops too well, but we gave it a go a couple times each training cycle, and then we would do ascent and docking trans-earth injection, and then landing. We didn't do much in the world of medical stuff, because if you took a crew member, made him sick, then he didn't get a valid day's training, and training time was pretty precious for those guys. We typically ran somewhere between 25 and 30 full days of integrated simulations with the crews. There were typically 3 to 4 flight control teams, and each crew in those days had a backup crew. So the lead flight director and the commander would decide who ran on what day. But there was only one of us, so we didn't really care who showed up. We did as best we could about conducting the various phases, and then at the end of each of those runs, which would run from 10 minutes for a launch abort to maybe half a day for a lunar orbit insertion or a Earth return insertion sim. Landing and ascent sims were somewhere between 10 and 12 a day. So at end of each one of those, we'd conduct a debriefing. The flight director would lead it off, have his team member that was affected by whatever problems came up, and they discuss their opinions on what needed to be done, and in response, whether it was a good action or not a good action, or what they want to do next. And then at that, my position was called the simulation supervisor, so we would come in and then give our assessment of the team's performance for that particular thing. Did they meet the intended objectives for the mission? The emphasis that we placed on them was first and foremost team building. You had a strong set of personalities in each of the flight crews. You had a strong set of personalities on the ground teams, and our job was to provide the opportunity for them to learn to work together, whereby the people on orbit would trust the ground to do what it was appropriate for the ground to do, and vice versa. And that was the major objective for everything that we ran. We'd attend all Glenn and the flight control team ran on a set of rules called mission rules, which said if this happens, this is what the response will be. They talked those out, thought them through completely, and then we would selected one of those and put in a problem which would surface that mission rule and let them conclude that it was that they had come to the right plan, and that it had been executed as it should be. There was also a fellow there in Houston named Bill Tyndall, who used to run what they were called mission techniques meetings, which were basically how are we going to do everything that we're going to do in this flight. We'd attend all those meetings, and then similarly pick out things that we wanted to do to test the team on their ability to perform that technique item as they had anticipated. We'd use the sims to integrate new basically the same flight control team shifted around to various phases, but each mission was a new flight crew, so we had to build a new set of confidences between them, and early on the progression was was non-trivial. I mean, when you think about what Apollo 7 did, and then 2 months later we're going to the moon, and 2 months after that we're doing test of the limb, and 2 months of that we're going back to the moon, and 2 months after that another back to the moon. It was pretty hectic, and we tried to keep all that in focus and in balance. It was kind of interesting. the control center in those days had 3 floors. The first floor had all the computer systems, and the second, third floor were identical mission control rooms. Our integrated sim cycle with the crew were 3 months long, and we were running on 2-month centers, so you can pretty well figure out that for a couple of times there, one day we'd run on the second floor with one mission, and next day we'd run on the third floor with the following mission, and then vice versa. And typically we'd do about 3 days a week with each crew. And so those short periods, that was 6 days a week of sim guys, because we only had one team, and that meant the 7th day was what are we going to do next week. So there's a lot of sim scripts that are written on the back of bar napkins, and because we didn't really have time to keep up with what we're doing, but the whole focus was on team building, and never ever was there an opportunity for a gotcha. We didn't think that was productive. We didn't think it was productive on the cruise time, and certainly on the flight control time or ours. So we were not in the gotcha business. We were in the put it out there. You said you were going to do this way. Is that really what you want to do? Now, occasionally, the simulators were unforgiving, and they would drop something in the punch bowl that sort of caused the sim to go south, and sometimes you were able to just call a flight director and say, you want to play this one, or you want us to recycle, and we do based on whatever they wanted us to do. And your little thing said what were some of the challenges, and then kind of in no particular order. Obviously, keeping up with the new mission profiles as everything was multiplying so fast from a mission content point of view, making sure that the configuration of the simulators in the control center was consistent with the upcoming mission, and that we hadn't fallen behind in making some updates or things. A big one was is this problem credible? Well, who knows? We were kind of in uncharted territory, so in some cases you didn't really know whether this was something that could happen or something that was completely off the wall, and so we would get sometimes some back channel critique of whether or not things were credible or not, but we tried our best to keep them honest and real. There was also a lot of, since there was so much going on and we had such limited time, there was a lot of, well, what are we going to do? Because the one thing, the hardest part of my job was to keep the sim going in a balanced point of view, because you got a flight director and 20 flight controllers out there sitting on their consoles, each one of whom would like something to do. But if you gave all of them something to do, then Glenn and other flight directors would be inundated with people calling them saying, well, flight, we need to do this, flight, we need to do this, flight this, flight that. So you kind of, what I would do is just sort of listen to his loop and listen to the traffic on the loop, and then try to modulate what we were doing sort of based on how busy he was in a particular thing. And if a flight controller looked like he's kind of bored, well, we'd go fail some piece of instrumentation or something and chase that to keep he and his back room busy. So big problem with making sure that the flight control team and the flight crew were not overloaded, so that the training exercise didn't have any redeeming social values. Say, one of the biggest things I worried about was the burnout of the sim team, because I think we led the division in divorce rate, which was not an uncommon metric to keep around Houston and down in Florida during those time frames, because folks were working at the rate that they were working. You'd work 10 or 12 hours a day, and then you couldn't wait to get back out there the next day. So sometimes that was a burden on the home front. I mean, one of the other things was, what we achieved. Well, I think Glenn voiced our greatest achievement a while ago when he said the team was trained. And all the missions were successful, so that was sort of an indication that it was. I think we didn't invent the simulation system in Apollo. Actually, Glenn was one of the originators of its need and what we're going to do way back at Langley in the Mercury days, and it got refined up until the point where during Apollo, I think you would say that we verified that the concepts that were developed along the way were the correct ones to do, because basically that system was used in the shuttle, and then I kind of lost track about what was going on out there after that. And the contributions, I mean, I think you can ask these guys, Jeff, Jim Voss, somewhere around here, some of the guys, that whether we did a good job or not. So, thank you.
I really appreciate all the panelists' presentations. Just a yes or no question to either Jay or Glenn. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the landing on the moon. It's my understanding, back to training and mission control, is that the final sim for landing on the moon, the mission control team made the wrong call, and they lost a landing. Is that unusual?
Well, no. Actually, the alarm came up.
Yeah.
And a lot of people take credit for putting it in. In my world, I don't remember who put it in, but it's possible that it even came out of the computer. The simulator may have belched it out. But at any rate, going down the 1201, 1202 alarm showed up, and nobody knew what to do about it. And I can't remember whether they aborted or went ahead. Gene was the flight director, but I know that after that sim, they got in a room, and the first question was, what in the hell's a 1201 alarm?
Okay.
And that got answered, and then it became, well, how many more are there? And it turns out there's a whole bunch. So Jack Gorman and Bales and a whole bunch of other people from MIT and other went through and listed all the alarms and what they meant and how they should fit into the mission rules where they to show up. But if you listen to the air to ground, when the first one shows up, first thing Charlie said is, "We've seen this before." Yeah. And that's what it was. Yeah. They had seen this thing in the cell.
One question from the audience. I think we're over our time and need to go eat lunch.
Yeah, I wonder if there was a contingency plan if the astronauts came back contaminated from the moon.
You wonder if there was a sick man.
Contingency plan. I guess this is for Bill Carpenter. Was there a contingency plan?
What if they did bring something back? What were you going to do?
We would stay in quarantine forever. We had to sign a release, that if there was any suspicion, we wouldn't get out of quarantine.
There you go.
We had our
quit now?
we had our sick by guy.
Well, thanks so much to the panel. It's been fun. It's a great panel.